20, just turned 20. Just turned 20, and it's my first encounter in the justice system. I was scared. I was scared. That was my first time being in trouble for something like that. I said, I don't care, I ain't do it. Then later on at night, I got locked up. Me and my god brother, may he rest in peace, I got arrested. They said investigation. They hold me on the investigation for 3 days. Got mad because I wouldn't never admit to I was the shooter. After 3 days, I spent the next 2 years and 5 months in Kane County Jail. Then after that, next 9 years in prison.
I believe I was 28, and from New Orleans, a vacation trip from New Orleans, and arriving at my building, my neighbor said that the police had been looking for me. So I'm wondering why, you know, and so I kind of, for a little while, didn't pay it any attention. So I decided, I said, wait a minute, let me find out what they're looking for me for. So I called, you know, Detective Conley, left a card. So I called. And he said, well, you know, somebody said that a vehicle, one of your vehicles may have been used in a crime. So my vehicles couldn't have been, because I just came from New Orleans. He was like, okay, well, you just come in, and didn't sound right, you know. So I went anyway. I went into the police station thinking that I can go and straighten this out. So arriving at the police station, I sat in in what I thought was just a visiting room, but it was actually the orientation room. And I sat across from a guy maybe 5, 6, 7 feet away from me, and we conversated for like 40 minutes. They came in and he said, would you go into the lineup? I said, yeah. He said, he took me one way and took the guy another way. And he actually identified me for, you know, and that's how it began. Ended up going to jail. I ended up, he came in and told me I've been positively identified, and, you know, and I'm like, identified, you know, and they took me, you know, into custody. They kept me in the police station almost 3 days. Then they transferred me to 26 of California. After I went to Western and about 7 different other police stations, I guess, and ended up at 26 of California. And that's where it began. 3 murder, attempt murder. They charged me with a UUW, unlawful use, and then they charged me with disarming a firearm within the city limits. It's a whole lot of little things that they charge you with, and it was really ridiculous. And I'm just sitting here. They got to fix this, because, you know I'm the wrong guy. Didn't do any good. Texas told me that I don't know how they picked you out of lineup when the guy we was looking for was 6'2", light complected with long curly hair. So it's amazing to me how these things happen, and you not know that you're actually becoming a victim, you know, instead of somebody that's, you know, a part of trying to do things right. I became a victim. I was victimized by the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois, because they knew it. You know, state's attorney offices knew it. And so they wanted me to plead. I'm not pleading to nothing I didn't do. They said I served 10 years, but actually it was 14 years, because I was still a part of the system even though I was out. I just got exonerated in 2012.
Well, it all started for me with a case from Chicago. I had heard about a young woman who was sitting on death row, and she'd been sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And that made no sense to me, so I went out and met with her, and she told me that her lawyer had advised her to plead guilty, and she got sentenced on a double homicide without, you know, any kind of deal, and was waiting to be executed. So I recruited some law students to help me work on the case and investigate it, And over the course of a number of years, we started to discover a lot of evidence that she was factually innocent. So not only did she not receive a trial and was sentenced to death, which for me was outrageous enough in the United States, someone could be sentenced to death without any form of due process, but there was actually strong evidence she was innocent. And that case made me decide this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I was in Michigan teaching at Thomas Cooley Law School, and I quit that job and I moved to California and I started the California Innocence Project back in 1999.
My name is Anthony Murray. I was convicted of murder. In 1998, I was charged with murder. In 1999, I was convicted of murder. I got involved with the criminal justice system. I was downstate, Central Illinois, and a murder happened. And the state's attorney and the police were looking for guys from Chicago. And ultimately, they charged 4 people from Chicago with murder, but I was the only one that they really went at after the murder, for the murder. And it was a long journey, long fight. And I went through 2 trials. Ultimately had a 3rd trial coming, and I took what's called an alpha plea, and to obtain my freedom, because I didn't feel that I'd get justice going to trial. It was something that I regretted that day. It's something I still regret today.
It was Columbus Day weekend in 1997 that Julie was with her son Joel in her own house in Lawrenceville, Illinois. During the course of the night, someone entered the house. Joel was brutally stabbed to death, and Julie struggled with the intruder who perpetrated the crime as he left the house. The state conducted virtually no investigation that an outside perpetrator committed the crime. There was virtually no attempt to go beyond Julie in order to find the real perpetrator of the crime. Julie was indicted by a grand jury in October of 2000, almost 3 years to the day after Joel was murdered. The Office of the State Appellate Prosecutor was appointed as a special prosecutor, conducted the grand jury proceedings, and then was involved throughout. There was no direct evidence that Julie murdered her son. The motive evidence that was introduced was extremely weak and illustrated a warped imagination of a prosecutor who portrayed Julie essentially as a modern-day witch with virtually no evidence to fall back on. As part of their theory, the state speculated that Julie killed Joel because a year earlier her ex-husband had been awarded child custody, even though there was no evidence that Julie had reacted any different than a normal mother would on the short end of a divorce ruling. And at that time, Julie was pursuing her PhD at Indiana University. Shortly after her conviction, Tommy Lynn Sells, a serial killer on death row in Texas, confessed to the killing. And it's another story by itself. Despite confessing details to the Illinois State Police that only the murderer really could have known, the prosecution still refused to reopen the investigation and reopen Julie's case. That refusal, plus major evidence of misconduct by the police and the prosecutors, continued throughout the case. Julie Ray was innocent of this crime, that she spent 6 years at least on and off in prison, and that she is now, to the extent that one can talk about it in terms of at least her body and hopefully as much of her spirit as she can marshal, a free person, legally innocent within the state of Illinois.
When my appeal was effective and my first conviction was vacated, I love this one. Whoopsie, our fault. You've been in prison for 2.5 years. No, our mistake. So, like, they process you and you're going to get a go, but, you know, all this paperwork, all this time. And then I found out that, yes, it was vacated and I was free to go, but they released me into the hands of the sheriff who was going to rearrest me and recharge me. Couldn't even have 5 minutes. How do I describe what my life was like after exoneration, I asked myself. Simply stated, it was my miracle come true. There's nothing you think about more than what that miracle is going to look like and feel like when you will be able to tell when it comes true. And it's quite easy to predict the answer for the miracle question for an individual who's wrongly convicted. First on every inmate's list is getting to hug and hold your friends and family, then taking that deep breath of fresh air and filling your lungs with freedom. But for the innocent, you can finally spend your energy on things besides having to fight what everyone who knows you already knows is true. For Anthony, he took a lesser plea, but he maintained his innocence so that he could be home with his family and friends and do the things that when you get put in prison, you real quick figure out are the most important things in the world. And that's being there with your family and your friends. All the superficiality and materialism, believe me, it falls away real quick. And this part of the miracle, finally being able to be free of trying to prove that you're innocent, which for Anthony he's still struggling with, is the desperation that the Innocence Project helps you with, and it's the part of the miracle that for me has come true. Even if, God forbid, I had not been acquitted, having had the Innocence Projects force my truth to be heard and recorded, and it was through the second trial and through the media, through people like Larry, through everybody that looked at my trial, looked at my case. Having that recorded was in itself a type of exoneration, and I cannot say this too clearly or forcefully. It is a critical part of the process, perhaps in some ways, and I don't minimize the importance of being free physically, but in some ways even more important than physical freedom itself. Acknowledgement of the truth of who you are when the whole of society, through a wrongful conviction, has turned away from you is a huge and powerful force.
When I was 16, I was wrongfully accused of a crime I didn't commit. I was accused of rape and kidnapping on my high school campus, summer going into my senior year. And at that time, I was a highly ranked football player. I was on my way to USC on a full scholarship. And a girl that I've known from middle school, now in high school, she and I decided to go in an area that's on our campus that's known as a makeout spot. And we made out, but we never had sex. And by the end of that day, I was being arrested and accused of kidnapping and rape. I was arrested that day. I was given a bail of I believe $1.25 million, so it was impossible for me to bail. So I fought this case from behind bars, starting off in juvenile hall at the age of 16. I was later tried as an adult. They felt that the case was too serious for juvenile court, and went from facing minor camp time to 41 years to life in prison.
Thanks.
So didn't go to trial because the day of jury selection, my attorney presented me with this deal, and this was about the third deal. I think the first deal was 25 years in prison, the second deal was 18 years, and I was turning down all of these deals left and right. On the day of jury selection, she came to me in a holding cell at the courthouse and said that she just worked out this deal with the DA, and that deal was that I'd plead no contest to 1 count of rape. I'd undergo a 90-day diagnostic, which is serving 90 days at Chino State Prison in California, where during those 90 days I'd be interviewed by a psychologist and counselor, and they determine on a ladder system where I receive probation 3 years or 6 years in prison. And my lawyer at the time promised me that I'd receive probation, guaranteed it, and said that if I didn't take this deal, I'd be walking into this courtroom and selecting a jury that would more than likely be an all-white jury, and they'd see me guilty because I was a big black teenager, and I was facing life in prison. And so pretty much this deal was presented in a way where she made it seem so much more better than actually fighting for my innocence. And I was 17 at that time, and took her advice as being my attorney, and as an adult, wanting to just be home and be free, I took the deal. I went on a 90-day observation. I was interviewed by a psychologist and counselor. They determined that I was in jail for something I didn't do. They read the case and they saw right through it, and they recommended the lowest sentencing, which was probation. After the 90 days, I went back to court with this favorable report, and the judge sentenced me to the high term of 6 years anyway, with no explanation. A few weeks later, I found myself in prison. So I was serving a 6-year sentence. I had to serve 85% of it, and so I had to do a total of 4 more years and 2 months. I did a total of 5 years and 2 months incarcerated. And I came home when I was 22, so I spent 6 birthdays behind bars.
I grew up speaking Mixteco and Spanish. I went to school to learn that. I went to school in Mexico for only 6 years. I came to the United States because I wanted to do something different than my father, who was a farm worker, and wanted to go on with my education. But there was no such opportunity back home, so the only way was to my idea was to come in here and save money and go back to school. About 18. Well, the first time I came to California, but as a migrant worker, we had to follow the crop, whatever there's a crop season, we had to follow. And in this case, in Oregon, there was a strawberry that business that used a lot of hand labor to harvest. So that's one of the reasons that I ended up here in Oregon in 1986. And along with other like 200 and something workers, and there was a party and there was a fight and somebody died, and I was there, and that's why the police took me to custody for interview. Even though they provide, I remember that the first lady that talked to us about what happened. She was from the sheriff's department, spoke a very broken Spanish. I knew that she would ask, but wasn't enough to express, the whole situation. Because one of the police who was part of the investigator, he's told us, he said that to the media afterward, that I was not looking into his eyes when he was interviewing me, so that making him conclude that I was guilty. And they eventually decided that I was going to be the one who would be charged with the murder. I understand what they did, but I didn't understand why they found me guilty. A lot of the witnesses were forced to finger point to me. Other claimed that he was threatened with electric chair if he didn't testify that it was the one who did it. The evidence that they had, even the knife that they say was my knife, the police officer photographed him with the knife on his packet. So what does that mean, They didn't believe this picture, but they did believe what he said. And the reason he said, because he was threatened that he would spend the rest of his life all to the electric chair if he didn't say that I was guilty. Because of the language issue, I was not able to communicate with email or the jail system. I asked one of my lawyers that if they can find somebody who can teach me English. They found two people, and one of them is Donna, who is here with us, and she starting to come like first once a week, then twice a week, then more often. And the more I was able to learn how to manage language, the more I was able to express to her what had happened and that I did not commit a crime. After two weeks of trial, where there was a lot of how would you say it? The court didn't take it seriously. The judge didn't know that that Mexican people speak more than just Spanish. The cultural issue, the community, the people who were involved, everybody from the same community. So all that kind of stuff just was ignored. So eventually I was sentenced to life in prison, and I was sent to prison. Making impact in the case was that the 3 or 4 of the jurors, after the trial, after they heard me scream that I didn't do it, and then they said, well, we didn't hear him testify, we didn't hear his voice, so maybe he's not guilty, we did a mistake. So they feel sorry for themselves, and I think they contact Donna, or Donna contact them, and then become part of what they call the Santiago Freedom Committee, and trying to work with the committee. The whole thing took 4 years and a half, almost 5 years to get me out. They overturned the conviction.
I came involved with the criminal justice system through a situation with my younger brother, who's 2 years younger than me. His name is Richardson, and pre-1994 he was indicted because of homicide of a young lady that was the age of 24. Her name is Monica Reyes, and the way he was linked to this homicide was that he was linked to it via a bite mark on the lower left portion of her back. And the state had identified a dentist by the name of Ira Tatunic, who had stated that he believes with a high level of confidence that that was his dentation. And as a result of that, that began the ball moving in terms of his whole nightmarish ordeal. And but my brother had said that, I didn't do it from day one. He never recanted. He never staggered. He never had any problems stating over and over again, I didn't do this. And so the ball continued to roll forward. His public defender, because at the time he was indigent and no one in the family had access to $100,000+ for retainer for a lawyer to take the case. And let me just say as a caveat, my brother by far at that time in his life, in terms of some lapse in judgment, was not the angel, if you would. So I don't want to create that sort of context, but there are certain things that he would admit to, and there are things that he refused to admit to, and this homicide was one of those things that he refused to admit to. So we didn't have the resources to get a pool attorney, so he had to go with a public defender. The public defender by the name of Neil Hamilton took his case, and the first thing that he said to my brother, which my brother shared with me, was that, what kind of story are we going to come up with? As if he did not believe him initially out the gate. So there wasn't even an opportunity to begin the ball rolling to try to defend his innocence. And so I'm already operating in the auspices that you're innocent until proven guilty. He had already come with the story that you're guilty because they're saying this bite mark is yours. And so my brother said, the story we're going to come up with is you're going to defend me. I didn't do it. I'm not guilty. So the trial went on. And there were some good high moments and there were some low moments, but the day that my brother was going to be sentenced, because he had said that I didn't do this, I was so confident in the judicial process that said that he had proven, he had 2 experts, and that said that they disagreed. So to me, there was reasonable doubt. More importantly, they had taken hair fiber samples from my brother because hair fiber samples were found in the decedent. And they had sent that along with a bite mark swab to the FBI to be tested. But unfortunately, what happened was the bite mark swab for DNA testing was the only thing that was never tested. It was documented and sent to the FBI, of which I have documentation, which my brother was sharing paperwork with me. But the hair and fiber samples were tested, and the FBI came back and said there's no match between Gerard Richardson and Monica Reyes. They confiscated his cars, they vacuumed all the cars, and nothing connected them. No eyewitness, nothing. It was purely the bite mark. That's all they had. And so I didn't go to court that day. I didn't go to court, and what happened was I get a call, and I have a family member on the other end of the phone is crying. I said, what happened? He said, well, he's found innocent on one count, but guilty on another. They both carried 30 years. And so my brother had to stand before the judge at the time because it was in the newspaper. He's shackled, and he's saying, I will admit that I've done some things terrible, but I will never admit to having committed this crime. And so to Judge Coleman at the time, it would appear as though he was non-remorseful. So he not only sentenced him to the 30-year stiff, which means he had to do 30 years, do the complete 30 years the whole time, and he fined him above and beyond what he normally would fine someone that would be committed a similar crime. It would have been maybe a $1,000 fine. He fined him $5,000. So in a prison system, if you get a $5,000 fine, you're only making pennies on a dollar. It takes forever to try to pay that down and pay that back. So throughout the course of the years, there were some appeals. My brother was operating as a pro se litigant because at the time his attorneys, the public defenders, they don't take anything away from them. I think there's a great group of people, but I just think, in my personal opinion, that sometimes they're overworked, and it's just a matter of saying, let's get this thing pushed through the system and let's continue to move on to the next case. For some, just in terms of professionalism, I feel that it's just sort of a springboard to the ultimate where they want to go. So I get the legal experience, but I want to then move on to something else. And so my brother was doing a lot of pro se work in terms of motions. And it wasn't until he had an attorney, which he exhausted all of his public defender resources. At that time, the state then offers you what they call a pool attorney. The pool attorney basically says that this is a private practice, and we're going to go ahead and approach this thing a whole lot different. Because now you have a practicing lawyer that's going to come and try to defend you. And he had a gentleman that was, again, his name escapes me. I couldn't remember all the names. But nevertheless, it was discovered that the bite mark swab was never tested. So when it was discovered, and my brothers and the attorney submitted motions to get that to be tested, the prosecutor's office fought them to even release it, to say that there's no relevance to it, there's no need for it, it's procedurally barred, and all these other technical terms. My brother literally spent about another two years maybe going up all the way to the appellate court. And I have that briefing as well, their decision. They literally said, we are not going to overturn the lower court's conviction. So we affirmed that. However, their language, their specific words was, we are troubled that the prosecution does not want to release this bite mark swab, which is key to their linking him to the homicide, because the medical examiner had taken a swab of it and ordered them to immediately release it. It then took the prosecutor's office probably another 2 months, if that, to even release that. Initially, it was tested, and this was going back in 2009, I believe. It was tested, and somehow it managed to come back contaminated. So, hence, when we went back forward, the notes were sent to the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project then took the case on, and as they took it on, we had a wonderful attorney by the name of Vanessa Potkins and a slew of paralegals, Gina, Matt, Nicole, and Stephanie, all working on my brother's behalf pro bono, which at the time I felt, wow, I couldn't imagine the amount of money that would have cost to have that kind of intellectual horsepower operating on my brother's behalf. But yet we're getting it for free. So now I feel like we have a chance. He has some hope. And literally they worked it such that there was an opportunity to retest some more bite mark swab. It was discovered that there was another bite mark swab that had never been unsealed. And so that was one that was given to his attorney, and it was literally sent to a lab out in California, which then tested it. And oh, by the way, let me back up for a moment. The initial testing of the DNA bite mark swab came back with a partial profile. The prosecutor's office had someone from the FBI came in and say, that was somewhat inconclusive file. But when they sent the second one back to be tested by a different agency, they were able to grab a complete profile, and the profile did not match my brother. Not only that, but the partial profile matched the one that so there was consistency in terms of what they were reading. And as a result of that, we went through the whole process. The prosecutor got to the place where he said, well, you know, I want to send that report to the New Jersey State Police Forensic Lab and let them look at it to make sure protocol was followed, procedures were followed, and all those kinds of things. It took about maybe another month or so. When the report was sent back from the state police to the prosecutor's office to then call his attorney and say, I've got it back, I've made some determination, he didn't even announce it. They had to send a motion to the judge to say, what's the status of this? So when it all finally came down to it, it was agreed that they would overturn the conviction. And I know there's a legal term around that, but it escapes me. But they would overturn the conviction and act as if the trial had never occurred. And the prosecutor then had the determination to say, are we going to either totally dismiss it or are we going to retry him? The prosecutor is just reluctant to admit that they made a mistake. And it got to the place where the prosecutor literally said in court that the DNA may not be Gerard Richardson, but it does not impugn the bite mark. Okay, so in other words, you're saying that it's his bite mark, but someone else's DNA. So he bit the person, and somehow his DNA was never captured in the bite mark, and then someone else drooled on it, or there was spittle. And so for me, it was just showing how much of a miscarriage of justice this was, and it just further dragged this out longer and longer. My brother was released on October 29th of 2013. He spent 19 years and 6 months in prison.
I first learned about the Innocence Movement in 2001, about 2001, 2002. At the time, I was teaching high school in Chicago at a public school, and I had arranged for students to go and meet with different DePaul Law School professors, just to sort of give them a glimpse of law school and different areas of law when they were still in high school. And one of the professors who agreed to meet with the students is an attorney by the name of Andrea Lyon. And she's very prominent, very well known. She's an amazing female attorney. She was one of I think the first female attorney to first chair a death penalty case in the United States at trial. She's really remarkable and amazing, and I immediately was drawn to her and became friendly with her and learned of her work. And then she invited some of the students and myself to attend a conference at DePaul's Law School that was on race and the death penalty. And at that conference, there was a presentation given, and Governor George Ryan appeared alongside Madison Hobley, who was a man on death row who was innocent but was wrongly convicted of an arson in which his wife and children were killed. And he spent time on death row and was pardoned based on his innocence by George Ryan. And I saw them at this conference, and I had never really heard of the work before. I had never been exposed to it, and literally in that moment I was just awestruck, and I just knew that was what I wanted to do. So I actually applied to go to law school. After that, I took the LSAT and did that whole process with the intention of doing the Innocence Project in law school. So I applied for law school. I decided to go to Cardozo in New York, which is where Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld started the Innocence Project. And I went there so that I could do the Innocence Project clinic, which I did participate in, and been involved ever since.
Working on my master's degree in legal studies at University of Illinois Springfield. And in my last semester, I took the class Conviction of the Innocent with John Hanlon, and the class literally changed my life. Within a week of taking the class, I knew that this is what I was meant to do. My undergrad degree is in criminal justice, and then my master's is in legal studies, and it just felt like the right fit. So I began working I graduated in May of 2008, and then got a call from John that summer. I was doing some investigation work for an investigative agency, and John offered me a position part-time with the Illinois Innocence Project. I was the first paid employee for the project.
It's affected me personally because I prefer to be sitting out on my front porch watching the corn grow rather than being involved in this stuff. I mean, I'm 67 years old. I've got kids and grandkids and a wife of 45 years. And I'd really rather be doing something else. So that's how it's affected me personally. I mean, it's important that it be done. It's important. And if we get to the point where there are a number of other people who are doing this, who do understand, so that I don't need to be involved, I'll stop. I would love for that to happen.